as soon as I know that we are live. All right, and we are live. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Sarah Gott-Wallace, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Dr. Talbot Spivak Holocaust Memorial Committee. This afternoon, it is my privilege and my honor to present to you a dear friend of mine, Mr. Steen Metz. Steen's going to be sharing his survival story with us. He was a young Danish boy born in Denmark, and as he will be explaining to us, he experienced the Camp Theresienstadt. So it's always important to listen to as many survivor stories as possible for multiple reasons. First of all, people could be located in the same village, they could be part of the same family, they could be sent to the same place during the Holocaust. But based on those multiple variables, they will be vastly different stories. So just because you've heard one Holocaust story, I don't want you to think that you've heard them all, because they're all going to be very, very different, as you will hear from Steen as well. Steen has a very, very unique story. Another reason why it's important to listen to as many survivors as possible is because one day this amazing, brave, strong generation will no longer be able to share their stories with us firsthand and to share their primary accounts. And it's going to be up to us going into the future to be the beacons of truth and hope and light, but mostly truth. It's going to be up to us to stand up against anti-Semitism and Holocaust deniers. We're seeing a rise in both anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, not just international, or not just globally, but internationally, I should say, not just in our country, but everywhere. So it's through listening to survivor stories, stories of their descendants, that we are able to keep the actual truth of the Holocaust around and alive. Holocaust education is so very important to myself and to Steen as well, as is Holocaust memorial and memory. So please, if you would, listen closely to Steen's story today, and please share Steen's story with at least 3 people, but don't stop there. Share it with as many people as possible. Go up to people in the grocery store. Hey, let me tell you this story while we're waiting in line here. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Steen Metz. Thank you, Steen. It's all you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Sarah. I couldn't agree more. Education these days is more important than ever. People are starting to forget about the Holocaust, and that's why I like an opportunity to talk to people, whether it's people in Florida or in the Chicago area, it's not important. But I want to reach as many people as possible. I want to start off by saying thank you for inviting me. And thanks for the co-chairs for memorializing Kristallnacht. I know some of you may have heard about it before, previous survivors talking about it. It was actually yesterday, November the 9th, 82 years since the Kristallnacht. I'm not going to talk very much about the Kristallnacht, but I just want to remind everybody about it. It's a very, very important historic event. Many people feel that November the 9th, 1939 was the beginning of the Holocaust. That's the time when everything was accelerated. Hitler actually started the Holocaust in 1933, but I like to call the Kristallnacht, it was a tipping point, unfortunately, to the arrest and death of 6 million Jewish people that perished during the Holocaust and millions of others. Now I want to start off by saying, as a survivor, I feel very lucky being here today, being able to share my Holocaust experiences with you. When I talk, I use whatever I can remember. I was 8 years old, so there are things I couldn't remember, but fortunately, I have been able to talk some of the events with my mother. She also was interviewed, so I will use some of her talk from the interview so you get a better picture of what actually happened in Theresienstadt, the camp I was in. No matter who I talk to, I ask each person to talk to at least 4 people about the Holocaust. Tell them you know that the Holocaust took place. You were an eyewitness to the story by a survivor. As Sarah mentioned earlier, Holocaust denial is rising. Vandalism of Jewish property is increasing. So we must tell as many people as possible about the Holocaust. If I may have the first slide. A Danish boy in Theresienstadt. That's a book I wrote 10 years ago. Theresienstadt is the name of the camp I was in. That's the German version. Theresen would be the Czech version. And as I talk and tell the story, I will use both destinations, Theresienstadt and Theresen. Reflections of a Holocaust survivor. There's only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted future generations to remember the Holocaust. The next slide, please. In Denmark, the Holocaust actually started on April the 9th, 1940. I was almost 5 years old when Hitler invaded Denmark on April the 9th, 1940. It was a surprise. That's probably the understatement of the day. It was a shock when the planes flew over. They invaded Denmark by air, by sea, and by land. And you can see in the southern part of Denmark, we border up to Germany. Why was it a surprise? We had signed a non-aggression pact, with Hitler. We wanted to be neutral. You couldn't trust the man. You knew early on he was a bad, bad man. The invasion was short-lived. Denmark surrendered the same day. I'm not going to take a position whether that was good or bad. I'll let history judge it, but it probably saved thousands of lives. We still lost some people. There was some battle going on, especially in the southern part of Jutland. Denmark made an arrangement with Germany that they would try to cooperate. Consequently, the government was able to stay and govern. The king was able to continue to rule in Denmark. It's a very, very unique situation. I don't believe it happened in any of the other about 20 occupied countries by Hitler, by the Nazis. When I think back, I'm very surprised that the first 3 years, they were relatively normal, with emphasis on the word relative, but certainly relatively normal compared to what happened in Holland, Czechoslovakia, and so on. I was able to continue to go to school. I went to a public school. My father was able to continue to practice law. If we had lived in the Netherlands, Belgium, or Poland, those rights would be taken away from us. and I would not be able to go to public school. My father would not be able to practice law. Can you imagine if you lived in one of those 20 occupied countries, the human rights taken away from you? It's absolutely amazing. And it's equally amazing that in Denmark, situation was quite different. Why was it different in Denmark? I believe one of the main reasons was the Danish food products. We used to ship them over to Great Britain. That stopped immediately, and we started feeding the troops and Nazi troops in Denmark. And we also sent products down to Germany. I understand that we supplied about 15% of the agricultural products, such as bacon, eggs, cheese, and butter that were shipped down. If I may have the next slide. One of my favorite slides from 1940, as you can see, King Christian X, he was in his early 70s, would ride on his horse in the park every single day. I believe normally in the morning. Look at the picture. No bodyguards, nobody around him. And the two Nazi soldiers saluting the king. The king is looking straight forward. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the Nazis. He hated them, and he wanted to support the Danish people, especially the Jewish people. And that's one of the reasons why he rode on his horse every day. Not only was he able to rule the country, and as I mentioned earlier, it's very, very unique situation. Royalty in other countries, like in the Netherlands, they fled, some of them to Canada, some of them to Great Britain, but the king and queen in Denmark stayed behind. Likewise, our government was able to continue to govern. They had some limitations. They had to follow, as an example, they were not allowed to hire any Jewish people. May I have the next slide, please? If you recognize that young fellow in the picture there, I guess I haven't changed very much. This picture was taken in the summer of 1943. And there's a much more important reason why I want to share the picture with you. Every time I see the picture, I cannot believe that my mother, my father, and I were able to go on vacation in the summer. I think it was summer of 43, while the Germans occupied just about every street corner in Denmark. They didn't abuse any of us. I would go to school, I would bicycle in town. We lived like outside, kind of in a suburb. And I would try to avoid the German soldiers, what I refer to as their ugly green uniforms. Unfortunately, the relatively normal conditions stopped in the fall of 1943. Sarah, can we go back to the map? Thank you very much. Young people, many of them in upper classes in high school, colleges, universities, they were not happy that the Danes surrendered so easily. So they formed separate groups in just about every city you see on this map. Those groups got weapons from Sweden. Sweden was neutral throughout the Holocaust. You can see Sweden east of Denmark in the creamy color. You can just see part of it. They also got weapons from Great Britain, and they would fly them in, at night and drop them in parachutes, and the young people would pick them up. They also had ammunition. And what was special in the fall of 43, they accelerated their objective, their goal, which was to limit products that were made in Denmark and shipped to Germany, prevent them from going to Germany. They bombed rails, they bombed rail cars. They did such a great job, and it's amazing that these young people had nothing to do with the Danish government, nothing to do with the armed forces. They did it all on their own. By the way, the city Odense in the middle of the map, that's where I was born, and I was born and raised in Denmark. They were so successful in preventing products to reach Germany that the German commandant went in to the Danish prime minister and said, this sabotage has to stop. You have to arrest the saboteurs and you have to send them to jail. No way would the Danish government agree to do that. They resigned, a Danish administration took over, and that became the beginning of the arrest of the Jewish people in Denmark. Once again, something wonderful happened. One of the German officers heard about the arrest date. We're now talking about late September, early October, leaked the word to the Danish government. They leaked the word to the synagogue in Copenhagen. By the way, most of the Danish Jews lived in the area around Copenhagen, about 95% of the Danish Jews. At that time, we had 8,000 Jewish people in Denmark out of a total population of 4.5 million. Many Danish families stood up for what they thought were right. They helped the Jewish people. They would hide them in churches. They would hide them in hospitals. They would hide them in summer houses, cabins, wherever possible. As a result, 95% of the Danish population managed to escape to Sweden, and they spent the rest of the Holocaust in Sweden. Unfortunately, living in the middle of the country, and I always remind students that communication channels were so different in those days. We didn't even have television, and we certainly didn't have smartphones. We had newspaper and radio, as well as telephone. The telephone lines were cut off. So communications were very different. And to my knowledge, we had not heard about the upcoming arrest. So my family was shocked on October 2nd, 1943. 2 Gestapo officers pounded on our door. It was early morning. My father answered. We got 40 minutes to get ready. My mother and I were allowed to go downstairs at the street level. The baker was there, and we got some bread and some rolls to take with us. My father was back in the apartment, and we might have had a chance to escape through the basement of the apartment. But my mother couldn't do that because my father, who was in our apartment on the 3rd floor, he would have been shot immediately. Can you go forward with pictures, please? Thank you. This picture shows the Danish Jews that were arrested and assembled in a schoolyard in downtown Odense. You can almost see the people standing against the wall with suitcases behind them. I have tried with magnifying glasses to find my family there, but it's impossible. I can't. Also, you can see the truck on the left, and that's how we got from my apartment to the school. And later on, we were in the same truck and ended up on the next slide, please, in the West Coast. This is the cattle car, very, very similar to the one we were shipped, deported in to Ravenstadt. It was completely dark, no chairs, no blankets. They didn't give us any food, nothing to drink. It was completely dark. I tried to look at some of the faces. People looked in shock. They were very, very quiet. It was totally unexpected. And I couldn't understand. I was 8 years old. Why was I in the cattle car? What happened to my neighbor? What happened to my cousins? Why are they not here? Are we anything special? We spent over 80 hours in the cattle car. Fortunately, we had some rolls and bread from the baker, which we shared with other people. Some people had snacks and sandwiches, and we shared that. We didn't know any of the people in there. Many of them were young people that had escaped from Germany earlier and were working in Denmark on farms. We made a stop, got some fresh air, some water to drink, and then we were back in the cattle car. And on the next slide, you will see we arrived in Særsen, about 550 miles from my hometown, Odense. Særsen is located in what was then Czechoslovakia. Today, it is the Czech Republic. The camp is located about 40 miles north of Prague, the capital and the biggest city in Czechoslovakia. On the next picture, the next slide, you see the train station, and we had to walk about 1.5 miles into the camp. At that time, there was no train station in Særsen. As soon as we arrived in the camp, they ordered us to empty our pockets. They took our money, jewelry, good clothing. They went through our suitcases. It's amazing the way they treated the Jewish people. My father told me later on that while in the apartment, the Gestapo officer said, make sure you bring money. You'll have an opportunity to use your money. This was the way we used our money. So in the camp, people were separated. Children, you were a child if you were 15 years or younger, men, women, and seniors. On the next slide, I have an illustration from a loft. This is very similar to the one where my mother and I spent 18 long months. Yes, it may sound strange, but somehow my mother was able to convince the Gestapo that I could stay with her. I was 8 years old. And I've spoken to other survivors, and they had done the same, but it's not very common. And there were no children that were staying with their fathers. They would all be staying in dormitories. If you were 16 years or older, you were considered an adult. You had to perform slave labor. The more I think about it, the more I feel my father's situation was most unfortunate. As I mentioned earlier, he was a lawyer. He was used to practicing law in the office, litigating in courthouses. And suddenly, in the beginning of the winter, we're talking about October and November and December, he had to perform slave labor, road work, very, very heavy work on the roads. He was not used to it, got very little food. I'll talk about that later. And then eventually he lost 50% of his body weight. He went into an infirmary. He spent 2 to 3 months there. They had excellent doctors, excellent nurses from many, there were prisoners entering from many different countries, and they tried very hard to save my father, but they were not successful. He just couldn't survive, and the doctors didn't have the right supplies or the right equipment. My father passed away in March of 1944, less than 6 months after we arrived. My mother and father at that time had been married less than 10 years. Later on, I heard from a young man who was in my father's work group that my father was physically abused. He was kicked, he was whipped when he didn't perform to the speed that the Nazis expected. It was very difficult for him to keep up since he was so thin and didn't have much strength. And that's why eventually he ended up in the infirmary. To my knowledge, my mother was not physically abused. Oh, I forgot to mention that in the death certificate for my father, there was no way the Germans were going to list the fact that he died of hunger, starvation, which is the truth. They put on that my father died of pneumonia. So I don't believe my mother was physically abused. It doesn't mean that women and children were not physically abused by Gestapo. At least my mother didn't tell me that she was physically abused. But she was, on a number of occasions, what I refer to as mentally abused. One day, she had finished cleaning the floor of a big, big factory. It was late in the afternoon. An officer came in, looked around, saw the bucket with dirty water, literally kicked the bucket, and the dirty water flowed all over the factory's floor. My mother had to redo the floor. She was very, very exhausted, very, very tired. They worked 10 to 12 hours a day, including weekends. And I'm not even sure what happened on the Christian and the Jewish holidays. When my mother came back to the barrack and told me the story, she was very upset. And I cannot understand how one human being can act like that towards another human being. But that's the way they were. Being 8 years old, I didn't have to work. My mother thought it would be a good idea if I did some voluntary work. Not much you can do at that age. I became a messenger, and I would take messages and documents from one German office to the other. And I would do that a couple of hours in the morning, a couple of hours in the afternoon. I would never talk to the Germans. They spoke German only, and I spoke Danish only. They were sitting there with their revolver, and they looked very, very intimidating. And I tried to leave the office and get to the next one as fast as possible because I didn't want to take any chances. But they never touched me. They never did anything to me. So one afternoon, when I finished working, I passed the kitchen, and at the end of the kitchen, I saw big sacks of raw potatoes. I looked around to make sure nobody could see me. Nobody was watching me. And I grabbed a couple of potatoes, raw potatoes, put them in my pocket, and started walking back in normal tempo to my barracks. My mother and I shared the potato. We ate them raw many times. We needed all the help we could get. Yes, technically, I was a thief. I shouldn't have done it. I believe if I'd been a little older, I probably wouldn't have dared doing it. And in a way, I'm surprised that my mother didn't discourage it. But as I said earlier, as far as food was concerned, we needed all the help we could get. As an example of breakfast, we would line up and get what was called coffee. It was really boiled water with coffee substitute and some margarine and some bread. And here you see people lined up, similar to what we did at breakfast. This happens to be lunch. And you can see some old people at the end of the line with their canes. As far as I remember, we were standing in line maybe up to 30 or 40 minutes. At lunch, we got potato soup day in and day out. I don't remember any other thing we got for lunch. We tried to get to the bottom of the kettle so we at least could get some of the potato peels. In the beginning, I didn't eat the potato soup. I didn't like it. And my mother said, Steen, you're not going to make it unless you eat the soup. That was all the encouragement I needed. I started eating the soup. How were we able to exist on those meager portions? 35,000 people died, most of them from hunger, starvation, out of a total 140,000 in the camp, right from the beginning of the camp. That is a huge number of deaths. And then, of course, there were many other people that were very weak and they were not very healthy. Can we have the next picture, please? Oh, that's true. Just go back, please. Thank you. I believe the fact that we started getting packages from Denmark, clothing, vitamins, and food, I think that saved my life and my mother's life. Everybody in the camp, from whatever nation you were entitled to get packages from their homeland or wherever people would send them packages. I believe the Danes got more packages than anybody else for the simple reason that the Danish people felt very bad about the Jewish people, about the way they had treated, the Nazis had treated the Jewish people. So one day, my mother is opening a package. It's very, very heavy. no clothing, no food, no vitamin. What happened? I'm sure the guards enjoyed the Danish butter, the Danish salami, and so on. I get very upset every time I talk about the package, because not only had the guards taken the good stuff, but they had replaced it with a brick. That's why the package was so heavy. One other incident that I like to relate to you from camp. I was 9 years old by that time. I had outgrown my shoes. How would my mother get shoes? No stores, no department stores, certainly no shoe stores. She bartered with a Czech lady, and the Czech lady got some Danish food, and my mother got some used shoes that I could use for the rest of the time. Being 9 years old, I didn't think about it at that time. But later on, I was told that food was like gold. If you had extra food, you could get just about anything that you wanted. At dinner, we would stand up in a similar line and get a variety of soups, but at least it was a variety of soups. About once a week, we got a special pasta dish, dumplings. I'm often asked, what did I do in camp other than working a couple of hours in the morning and afternoon and lining up 3 times a day for food? I started playing soccer with some Czech friends. I learned the Czech language. It was easy for us to communicate. We didn't have a real soccer field, it was a gravel field. Imaginary goalpost. The mothers had taken some old clothes, tied it together, and we would kick it around. That was probably the only time I felt the way a 9-year-old boy should feel. Almost, and I want to emphasize the word almost, free. But I was in prison, and I spent 18 long months there. So one day, the Czech children didn't show up. I was very disappointed. I told my mother about it, and she said, don't worry, they'll be back. I never saw those children again. They were among the 85,000 inmates that were deported in cattle cars like you see here to death centers, extermination camps like Auschwitz and like Birkenau. I wasn't aware of the deportations. My mother didn't want to tell me about it at that time, but I heard about it later on. And conditions were absolutely horrible. People were literally being pushed into the cattle car with a Gestapo officer standing to the right. And there were couples and there were husbands that wanted to make sure they could go with their wife and vice versa. In many cases, they wanted to leave the children behind, had a better chance of surviving. And next slide, please. I went back to Tasman in 2009. I wanted to research for my book. I wanted to see it for myself as a free person. And the memorial you see here was, I don't know what year, but it was standing there. We took a picture of it. And I remember very clearly what happened at that exact spot. And that's why the memorial is there. Children about my age formed a chain, human chain, started at the crematorium. people were cremated in the crematorium. It was not gas chamber. Early on, everybody was buried in the ground, but they ran out of space. So they were cremated and put in what they called urns. It was really cardboard boxes. So we took the urns right from the crematorium, passed it to other people, and the chain went out. You can't see it very well, but at the end of the picture, behind the trees, there was a river. 25,000 urns ended up in the river. A friend of mine, who was 2 years older, was standing next to me, and he turned the urn upside down. I heard about it later, before he passed it on to me. The names and numbers of all the inmates that passed away was listed on the cardboard box, and he wanted to make sure that I didn't see that particular box. On the next picture, this slide certainly doesn't look like a concentration camp. What happened was that the Danish administration asked many times if they could come and see how the Danish people lived in the camp. Initially, the Nazis said no, but then they figured out maybe they could use it as good propaganda. And they began, with the help of inmates, working on beautifying cells. And suddenly the buildings were painted. There were storefronts. There were products in the storefront. We had never seen that kind of food they had. They had sinks. It didn't work. There was no plumbing. It was all for show. Suddenly we had a music pavilion and people were playing and singing. There were 10,000 older, frail people that were sent in deportation to an extermination camp, so the delegation couldn't see them. The delegation came from Denmark. There was a doctor from Switzerland and also from Germany. They spent about 46 hours in the camp, including lunch. They never saw what happened to us, where we lived and where we spent time, because, as I mentioned, it was all for show. And even the Danish prisoners were sent to better quarters, so the conditions weren't as tight as when we were in our regular barracks. And of course, right after, we were sent back to our barracks. It was a strange day. We were warned, don't talk to the Danish delegation. If you did, you would be shot. Nobody spoke to the Danish delegation. They went back to respectively Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland, not having the right picture of the camp. They only saw what I often refer to as a play. It was a big, big hoax. I want to move on to what I call happier times. And that happened on April the 15th, 1945. We had spent 18 long, long months in the camp. It was a great deal of uncertainty every day. Would we live? Would we have enough food? Would we be deported to extermination camps? Or would somebody shoot us? We lived day by day and didn't really know what went on outside our little world. And many of us didn't really care because we had to concentrate, focus on ourselves. So the white buses, and you can from Sweden, and again Sweden was neutral. You can see the Swedish flag, the Red Cross logo. A convoy of about 20 buses came to Tärsen, and in Tärsen, they picked up about 425, picked up about 425 Danish Jews. And we couldn't believe it until we were sitting in the buses, and the drivers from Denmark and Sweden were very courageous, driving through Germany to reach Tärsen with a lot of bombardment going on. It was a miracle they arrived, and it was a miracle that we were able to get back to Denmark and eventually Sweden. On the next picture shows us, we just passed the Danish-German border. Look at the welcome we got. You wouldn't know that Denmark was still occupied. And they gave us food, candy, snacks, and flowers, and whatever. And they were very anxious to see us and welcome us back. It gave us a very, very good feeling. And I'm amazed that they were allowed to do that. But it was towards the end of the war, which we heard. We didn't know about it when we were in camp. We didn't hear any news about war or camps, except some rumors. So we went through Denmark, and we were not allowed to stay in Denmark. So the bus on a ferry boat took us to Sweden. We were in a camp for about 10 days. They wanted to make sure that we didn't bring any illnesses into the country. We connected with our family after we were released, so to speak. It was wonderful to see the family. When you hear other survivors, most of them lost their entire family, which is so sad. But we were very lucky. Most of my family, actually, except my father, which is very, very sad, we escaped. Very, very unique. I have read about inmates that lost 40, 50 members of their family, and so on. So we spent a couple of weeks in Sweden, and the next picture would show the Danish flag. It was flying all over in Denmark on May the 5th, 1945, to celebrate the German surrender on May the 5th. Other countries, Germany surrendered at other times, but in Denmark, it was May the 5th. We celebrated as well as we could in Sweden, but it wasn't the same as being back in Denmark. And some weeks later, I think it was the beginning of June, we were able to go back to Denmark, back to my hometown. We had nowhere to stay. Our apartment had been rented out. Our belongings, furniture, and so on had been put in storage, I believe, by the company where my father worked. In other places, if you hear inmates returning to Poland, all their stuff, apartment, belongings were gone. People were stealing it. And very few people actually were able to return to normal life in Poland. I was able to get some teaching by a teacher in the school I went to. There was no official schooling in any camps. It helped a great, great deal with the homework, but with the schooling and the homework. What helped even more, I was able to return to my old classmates in school, 5th grade, starting in August, even though I'd missed much of 3rd grade and 4th grade. I believe the transformation from the camp to my home was much easier since I was among friends that I knew from earlier times. Some years later, I graduated from high school, then from a commercial college. Then I wanted to see the world, especially living in a small country like Denmark with, at that time, 4.5 million people and the size of Rhode Island, I believe. I joined a Danish food company. They did a lot of business outside Denmark. That's why I joined them. Had some special training in Denmark. Then I went to England. I went to Canada and eventually to the United States. I continued to work for the Danish company. But later on, I wanted a challenge working for an American company. And I joined Sara Lee and later on Kraft and a couple of other companies. They were all in the food business. Maybe subconsciously, I wanted to make sure that I would always have food and not go to bed every night being hungry like I did in Saracen. I stopped working. I've been in the United States since 1962. I stopped working in 1999. And it's hard to imagine that that is 22 years ago. When you get to my age, time just flies. And then I compared to the 18 months, not years in camp, and time there went very, very slowly. After I published my book in 2011, I started talking to the school where my grandson went. I had not planned to talk about my experiences in camp. I thought when I had written the book, that was enough. But that actually became a beginning to a new career. And since then, I've spoken to over 90,000 people, mostly students. And can you imagine if everyone relates the story to at least 4 people? We're talking about a lot of people that know about the Holocaust. This last slide shows my website. If anybody is interested in getting more background information, that is the website. I can go on and on, but I think this is enough for now. And I'm looking forward to comment and answer your questions. Personal questions are fine. If they become too personal, I'll certainly tell you.
Thank you so much, Steen, as always. The email, or excuse me, not email, the website address is in the chat box there. So if you are interested in having Steen speak for one of your organizations, by all means, shoot him an email on his website. Likewise, if you're interested in getting a copy of Steen's book, contact him through his website and he will get you all set up with that. He might even sign it for you. So be sure to post any questions that you might have for Steen right there in the chat box. Make sure that you're signed into YouTube in order to do so. I made that mistake earlier. And just to get us started here, I'll jump one question in here while we're waiting for folks to come up with their questions. When did you start to tell your girls your history, your daughters, your history? We've heard from several different children survivors today. So I was just thinking about that. When did you start to tell your daughters about your experience?
Oh, I think that's a good question to get us started. I cannot remember exactly when I told my girls. I would think they were in grade school when I told them. But I did tell them what had happened. But like a lot of survivors, I didn't talk a lot about it. As an example, my mother and I didn't talk very much about it, which may sound strange to you, but it's very common. As a matter of fact, there are some people that never talk about it, but I'm really glad that I started talking about it. I believe I talked more about it to my 2 daughters than my talk with my mother, and then even more to my grandchildren. I have 4 grandchildren, and they have all read my book, and they were kind of urged, encouraged, or more to read my book. And there's especially one of them seemed very interested in what's happening, and they heard my speech many times. I spoke in their schools. So they probably know more about what happened than their mothers at the same age. So that was kind of a long way of answering your question.
That's really good. I mean, I know that looking back on it now, my grandfathers both were involved in World War II. My mother's father was in the 101st Airborne. I mean, you name a big battle, it seems like he was there. And it just aches me that I can't talk to him now and ask him all the questions that I have as an adult or even as a teenager. So it's really great that your grandchildren and that your daughters have had the foresight to talk to you and ask you questions and get their family history. It's wonderful. No questions just yet. So in the same vein, following along with this, one of my questions for you would be, did you have any values or specific rules that you put into place for your children based on your experience in the Holocaust, do you feel?
One rule was finish your plate, finish your food. If you don't, no dessert. I don't know if it was always followed when I was traveling, but it was something I felt quite strongly about. And I would never leave food on the plate. I couldn't do that. And I tried to eat it all. And that probably relates to my life in the camp.
I'm sure, absolutely.
I may add that I've tried the same rule, so to speak, with my grandchildren, and it doesn't work.
You know, and just the foresight of children. I know that you and I have talked about this a great deal, but just it always gets me, that part of your story when all of the children were lined up to form a human chain going out to the river, and that friend of yours turned the urns so that you would not see your father's name and number. You know, just the wisdom of children. If only we could bottle that and sell it. Oh, what millionaires we would be, right?
It's amazing, and I'm glad you're talking about it because it's amazing.
It really,
yeah, I read about it in a paper. Somebody sent me a cutting when I got back. That's where I heard about it.
well, just the same as nobody asked you in school when you went back. Nobody asked you where you had been, what had happened to you.
They didn't. And when I started writing my book, I thought through it, and I couldn't really remember them talking about maybe one or two questions. And I thought that my mother, and that would be like her, and I don't mean it badly, she might have gone to the principal of the school and said, please make sure nobody asks questions about Tersen and Steen. But that was not the case. And when I started writing the book, I emailed some friends from the school and asked them, what happened? Were you told not to talk to me? And they said, oh no, we thought if you wanted to talk about it, it was fine, but we would not initiate it. And talking about wisdom on children, I would imagine, yeah, they were about 11 years old. Yeah, exactly, 11 years old at that time. So that absolutely is amazing. And I remember when we returned, my mother would always say, ask me questions rather than Steen.
It's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Steen. If anybody thinks of any follow-up questions, feel free to shoot me an email. It's Sarah Gottwallace. It's actually sarah.gottwallace at fsw.edu. And you can see the spelling of my crazy last name there in the chat box. And if you have any questions, email those to me. I'll get those over to Steen and he'll get back with you. Once again, make sure that if you're interested, jot down his email address or I keep saying that, his website address, and he will be happy to correspond with you directly. If you want a copy of his book, you can go through that website as well. Steen, thank you so much for your time today. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and have your story, especially have your story on record. We are recording all of these discussions that we have today and yesterday. So if there's anything you want to go back, anything that you missed, or anything you want to share with others, feel free to do so. That's why we are recording these, so that we can be a repository, so that we can archive all of these important stories. Speaking of important stories, at 6 o'clock tonight, please join us again when we will be hearing from Dr. Paul Bartrup, all the way from Australia. It's tomorrow over there, if you can believe it. So he's going to be speaking with us about British diplomatic heroes and the rescues of Jews in Germany during Kristallnacht. Very, very interesting topic. Looking forward to seeing you all again tonight. Steen, once again, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.